A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear friends. I'm pleased to be back after a bit of a break. This talk that I'm going to share with you today as a video is basically a talk I gave just over a week ago at a seminar that was organized by the Shariah Academy of the International Islamic University in Islamabad. I'm thankful to my friend, Dr. Ahmed Rahman, who connected me with the organizer of this seminar, and I'm grateful to the leadership and the organizers of the seminar who allowed me to give this talk. Now, as you can tell from the topic in front of you, it is about medical, psychological, and social aspects of gender dysphoria. This is a very important topic considering the developments that are happening in many Muslim countries pertaining to the rights of people who have gender dysphoria or who are transgenders and who have gender identity issues. So let's get started. Foremost, when we talk about gender dysphoria or gender identity issues, the foremost thing to recognize is the difference between sex and gender. Sex is determined biologically. So sex is based on the chromosomes, on the physiology and the physical appearance of the newborn. That's why in 99.99% of the cases when the child is born, the sexual differentiation is enough to label that newborn as a male or as a female. Now, in very rare instances, in one in several thousand cases, there may not be enough development of the child to assign that sex, or the child may, as he grows, he or she may not develop secondary sex characteristics, and in those cases we call that disorders of sex development. Conversely, gender is determined and socially. So it's about the social roles, behaviors, expressions, conduct, and preferences of girls and women versus boys and men. So it's more of a social phenomena and an individual phenomena. And when there is a issue with gender, it results in what we call as gender dysphoria. Now, just to spend a few more minutes on the medical aspects of sex, I'll try to highlight the chromosomal build of human body. So humans are made of 44 autosomes and 2 sex chromosomes. Every healthy male or female, has a total of 46 chromosomes, of which there are 44 autosomes, and they are the same between males and females. But in case of males, they have X and Y sex chromosomes, whereas females have 2 X sex chromosomes. Now, when there is a problem in terms of development of sex, and which can happen even at the fetal age. So the disorder of sexual development can happen and can be evident when the child is born, or it can happen, or it becomes evident around the age of puberty, which will be age around 10 to 12 years for girls and about 14 to 17 years in boys. So the secondary sex characteristics will define that. But the problem will still be either with the chromosomes or with the hormones that determine males versus females. So here are some examples. So the first column talks about the sex chromosome related disorders of sex development. So in that case, the child, so in first case you can see there I've written 44 plus X. So every normal male or female child has to have 44 autosomes and 2 sex chromosomes. So if a child is born with only 1 X chromosome, that's not sufficient to give that child a proper sex. But because X chromosome largely determines female characteristics, so a child born with the 44X chromosome structure will look like a female, but will not be a full female. Similarly, a child born with 44XXY chromosomal structure will look like a male because there is a Y chromosome, but will also have features of a female. And these cases happen one in many, many thousand cases of birth. Also, there can be problems during gestation, during when the child is still in mother's womb, that can affect the sex development of the child. And those are basically related to the hormones. So either the hormones are not enough, or there are too much hormones, or there are hormones or substances being consumed by the mother that are giving a boost to either male hormones, or female hormones. So these cases will result in disorders of sexual development. A doctor can do a complete physical history and a physical exam, and we can do genetic testing, other lab investigation to diagnose these DSDs and to treat them. This is distinct from gender dysphoria. Now, coming to gender dysphoria part, gender dysphoria basically happens when there is a mismatch between what one's biological structure is, or what one's sex is, and the gender role. So if the sex is if there are problems with the sexual development, or if there is a sexual disorder of development disorder of sex, so then the sex may not be well defined, and the person will not be able to take on a proper gender role. That is one scenario. But there can also be situations where the sex characteristics are developed, but the person is not content with that sex and wants to take on a different gender role. So if there is a mismatch between the sex and the gender role, that creates gender dysphoria. And these are DSM-5 characteristics, diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria. Because this is not a medical talk, I'm not going to go through the list of these diagnostic criteria. But I put this slide up because I know doctors, I hope that doctors will be watching this presentation as well. Now, when there is gender dysphoria, the doctors then have to do something about it. So what is gender dysphoria? That the sex is either undetermined for the individual to take on a definite role, or the sex is determined, but the gender role that the individual is taking is not congruent with that sex. So there are 5 types of interventions involved in diagnosing or treating or addressing the concerns of such individuals. And first is the psychiatric and psychological part, because some cases it may be just simply confusion related to adolescence, when a young adolescent who is just confused about the gender roles and how to integrate those gender roles into the sex that is still congruent. So only psychological psychiatric treatment might suffice for those individuals. But then we will get cases where the sex is not well differentiated. So the individual will need hormone treatment so the secondary sex characteristics can develop properly. There can be situations, there will be situations where sexual organ surgeries will be needed. There will also be situations where non-sex organ surgeries will be needed. For example, surgeries on the breast or surgeries on the vocal cords to change the voice from a male voice to a female voice or vice versa. And then there will be behavioral treatment so that the person can adjust to the gender that he or she finds suitable for himself or herself. In terms of, and the treatment part is where a lot of debate and discussion is happening even in Western countries. And that is much needed in countries like Pakistan as well. And there is a tremendous need to develop professional guidelines, professional standards about that. And if those standards and guidelines are developed in a multidisciplinary approach through joint statements that will incorporate different professionals who are involved in treating gender dysphoria, for example, urologists, psychiatrists, endocrinologists. So if they are on the same page, that will create a good work environment. Anyway, in terms of robustness and threshold of treatment and care, there are 5 important things that need to be kept in mind. First is the age. So if it's a real young fellow who is struggling, say a 10 or 12-year-old or 14-year-old, we have plenty of time. We'll need time to try to handle that. But if someone is already in the phase of adolescence, we may not have that much time because we need to determine what type of hormones need to be given and what surgeries need to be entertained, etc. Then we have to document the consistency of dysphoria. So in terms of gender dysphoria, it may simply be, in some cases, be due to a confusion about gender identity and gender identity roles. And in those cases, we don't want to rush to treatment or rush to surgeries and rush to interventions. As I mentioned, it is a multidisciplinary approach, so different professionals have to work together to address the issue of gender dysphoria. We also have to take into account the degree of invasiveness and then ongoing care as needed. So I'll highlight some examples to to highlight what I mean by this range of robustness and threshold. So if we have a patient who is whose feelings are genotype consistent, so we have a boy who has XY genome, 44XY genomic structure, so that's sex chromosome consistent. And the person is struggling whether that he is a boy or he's a girl, and we realize that there probably is some deficiency of testosterone because the testes were not properly descended; they are not functioning well. So we supplement, or we supplement his internal testosterone with some exogenous testosterone, and he develops into he develops proper secondary sex characteristics, and he's happy. And so it's a less complex, it's not a very complex case. Then there will be intermediate cases where the feelings are genotype consistent, but there are significant and major hormonal and structural issues that will need to be corrected over a long period of time and may require a few surgeries as well. The real complex ones will be where feelings are not consistent with the genomic structure. So someone comes who has an XY chromosomal structure, meaning that's a male, but he says he is a she. Or someone comes with an XX sex chromosome structure, meaning that's a female, but she believes that she would be better off being a boy or a man. So those will be the most complex and challenging cases. So far, I've basically covered some medical aspects of gender dysphoria or gender and some psychological or psychiatric aspects. Now, let's get to the religious and social dilemma. Now, even though I'm going to talk about gender dysphoria and gender choice, to understand this slide, keep in mind two other similar matters that pertain to sex and sexual freedom, as it's called, and those are homosexuality and abortion. So if we look at these problems, and I have been studying the psychosocial and political aspects of these situations for the last 10 plus years, especially with regards to the United States. So basically these are situations where individuals and the society at large is conflicted between religious values and human rights and human freedom. So religion, all religions, and I want to make a side note here, especially for my friends in countries like Pakistan who have not lived or worked in countries like Canada or United States or European countries. These countries are also religious countries. These are mostly Christian countries, and the way we see in Pakistan, for example, that on Friday the parking lot of mosques is full because people have come to offer a Friday prayer. Similarly, in these countries, on Sundays or in some Saturdays, you'll see the parking lots of churches full because people attend church, people do practice their religion. So these societies also struggle between religious values and freedom, or to use the term loosely, secular values. So religious values versus progressive values. So now religion in most cases, or in many cases, is prohibitive. It prohibits many things that individuals want to do out of free will. So, for example, religions forbid premarital or extramarital sex. So it's a prohibition. But an individual or two individuals who are willing may dismiss this prohibition by the religion. And that is what creates the debate at the religious and at the social and political level. There is an element of psychosocial distress embedded within this debate, within such discussions, because whenever there is a strong feeling about a certain prohibition, then anybody or any group or any organization or any movement that tries to break through it will create a psychosocial distress. And when that happens, it automatically creates an environment of social, religious, and political debate. I can tell you, and I've lived in the West for almost 3 decades, and I have been connected and I've lived in Pakistan for 3 decades, and I'm still connected very closely with Pakistan. Countries like Pakistan lack the platforms where such debates and discussions can happen. I'm really very happy that a prestigious religious institute like Islamic University and the Shariah Academy, they have started this. So I hope it expands. Generally, and again, I'm stressing the word generally, religiously conservative elements are more restrictive, and because they have some element of restrictiveness, then the issue of individual rights becomes highlighted by the liberal group. So, and that becomes the title, that becomes the focus of the debate, that the religiously conservative or generally conservative point of view is impinging upon individual rights. Versus when we take a liberal and so-called progressive view, it may be less restrictive, but it causes social and societal problems. And how it causes those problems, this was an important topic of discussion during the seminar, and I will address that. It itself needs several minutes to discuss. So I'll explain that in my next talk, inshallah. Now, just to highlight how these matters are debated and discussed, and how much difference exists even in countries like the US, here I'm just highlighting 3 questions of many questions. Like this is a public survey that was done by the famous Pew Research Center, and the link is provided underneath if you want to look up the full survey. So they asked they asked 18 or 20 questions pertaining to gender issues. So I've picked up 3 questions to highlight how even countries like USA are very divided on such matters, but they have platforms to discuss them, and that creates that generates some type of uniform outcome, or an outcome to which most people then agree to. So first question was, how many people, or what percent of people believe that society has gone far enough in accepting transgender people? Republicans, which are generally deemed as more conservative and religiously conservative, even in states, 66%, two-thirds of them believe that we have gone far enough, that the country has gone far enough to address gender issues, versus the Democrats, who are generally more liberal, only 15% of them believe that we have done enough. So they want to go further. Now, in terms of the question whether sex should be determined, whether gender should be determined based on sex at birth, 86% of Republicans say yes. Whatever is the sex at birth should be the gender of the individual, should determine the gender of the individual. Whereas 61% of Democrats say yes. So meaning that the 38% of Democrats think that sex should not bear upon gender. Similarly, when the question was posed whether transgender athletes should compete based on birth sex, 85% of the Republicans said yes, but only 37% of Democrats said yes. So meaning that Republicans are of the view that if someone is born with an XX chromosomal structure, and then later on takes on a female gender, she should not compete against females. she should compete against the males. But Democrats generally feel that she can be allowed to compete against the females. So this is just to highlight that such debates happen even in the Western countries. We need to open up opportunities within Pakistan and other Islamic countries to start these discussions. Now, these are just to highlight a few challenges that I see upcoming for Pakistan. The foremost is that there is a debate, and Pakistan is among those countries that has a legislation passed about, and that was a few years ago, about equal rights for the transgenders. So there's no second question about that. Yes, all humans, they have equal rights. And there is, all religions also agree to that. And there's not much to debate about the equality of rights. So nobody can be discriminated, nobody should be penalized, nobody should be judged, nobody miss an opportunity because of certain way or certain religion or certain race or certain gender orientation. So there's no doubt about that. And Pakistan is already making progress in this regard. The real challenge that I see is that there is lack of indigenous policies and guidelines. And that's not only about disorders of sexual development. That's about depression, schizophrenia, diabetes, anything. There's lack of indigenous policies and guidelines. We basically import guidelines. We just copy and try to rephrase them in a simplified language, or some of it into our language. And that is not a very healthy approach for any country that wants to develop. We need to develop indigenous policies. And I mentioned a few slides earlier, such matters usually require joint commissions or joint committees of various professionals that are going to work on that topic together, so that there is some consensus on how to handle that situation. Third challenge that I see is, as I mentioned in just a minute ago as well, there is significant Western influence through the NGOs, through the social media, general media. And that impinges upon the indigenous values. So while the West is, and Canada and particularly for last many years, is trying to be more cognizant of indigenous values and how to incorporate them into policies and how to be more mindful of them, countries like Pakistan are simply trying to copy and paste policies from the West under the influence of various NGOs that are largely funded by organizations from the West. So that's a big influence that we have to try to mitigate. Our society, Pakistani society, is conflicted between Islamic and Western schools of thought. It is not uncommon for me to come across posts and comments on social media, and as some of you know, I'm fairly active on Facebook. So those posts will either be just black and white look at religion versus West. Things are not like that. It's a gray scale mostly. Even Western countries struggle between religious values and liberal values. Pakistan is struggling between religious values and the Western values. We have to develop our own system of discussion and debate on those values to develop our own system. Now, how can we develop it? We can develop it if we have our conservative groups come to senses and work together. Usually it is the conservative groups are usually religiously driven groups. They are conservative groups, but when in a country religious groups are fighting between themselves, they cannot come together to debate a Western or a liberal model. So when those conservative groups are divided, there's not enough momentum in that school of thought to come to the table to debate it in a coherent way with the other group that is largely dominated by NGOs and the Western influence. So it's a need, it's a political need as well as a social need for the religious groups to come together to do their discussions within themselves, to do ijtihad or do whatever discussions or whatever methodology they choose to come to some consensus and then debate that consensus with the counter group. Now, here this talk ends, but as I said in the beginning, some very important points were raised during the seminar, and some of those pertain to the social and political topics that are of my interest. So I'm going to, inshallah, towards the end of this month, I'm going to upload another talk to address those points. Meanwhile, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them as a comment at YouTube or on Facebook, and I'll try to incorporate those comments and questions in my next talk as well. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.